Cellular Automata is like computational sort of like reality. There's trillion, and actually there's really infinity, but let's just call it trillions of different rule sets and starting patterns, each of these developing into, after you run them for a number of steps with these very simple computer programs, into a pattern that is represented visually or through code. What this is sort of like deep sea fishing for like novelty and complexity in these spaces that have never been explored. It's almost like what's on like the other side of the moon or like the bottom of the ocean. There's untold number, these calculations that have never been done. What you can see is if you look at the ones that have been done, because there's been millions that have been completed, there's a very small percentage of them that generate something that looks interesting. And when you look at it, I get the same feeling as I do when I get this like little tingle about a synchronicity or something.
You're listening to the Contango podcast, where we take you behind the scenes as we identify, diligence, and discuss private investment opportunities at the bleeding edge of Web3. Hey everyone, I'm excited to share with you my conversation with the Bittensor guru, Keith Singery, founder, podcaster, builder, and prolific advocate of the Bittensor ecosystem. Keith was one of the first people that I connected with when I joined the ecosystem and has been one of its earliest and most outspoken supporters. Keith runs an educational podcast called the Bittensor Guru Podcast, along with the fourth largest validator on Bittensor, also with the same name. He's also working on building a subnetwork focused on cellular automata, a subject that could easily have a podcast of its own. But in this episode, Keith and I discuss synchronicities, dynamic TAO, cellular automata, and at the end, we even do some rapid-fire subnet rankings. So with that in mind, here is my conversation with Bittensor guru, Keith Singery. One thing that really hit close to home for me is you talk a lot about what you call synchronicities. And you have a lot of synchronicities in your life. And I'll tell you, one other person that has a lot of synchronicities in their life is my mom. And I don't know what exactly it is or what exactly it means, but she's always telling me these stories of these wild things that are happening to her. And I guess the way I try and digest it is the universe is always trying to tell us things. And I think the people that are connected with who they are and connected and maybe looking for those signals themselves can tend to find that signal through the noise. And so I'd like to just hear your perspective on one, what do these synchronicities mean to you? And kind of how do you attribute these to your life?
First, I would say it wasn't always this way. Like if I think back to maybe like my first, 10 years outside of college, kind of like in my adult life, I would say like in my corporate career, I experienced like almost no synchronicities. I wasn't even really like, I was of course aware of the concept, but those things were not something that like steered my life in any direction. When I decided to leave the company that I worked for, and the name of the company was Aldi, they're a big like international discount grocer. When I decided to leave that company, but even in the months before that I left, all of the synchronicities started to stack on top of each other. So I'll give you a couple examples. And during this time also I was going through like sort of a spiritual journey. There's psychedelics involved. So like there were many like pathways opening up for different ways of interpreting the world, just for me personally. And then when the synchronicities started coming in, that's when things I think really started to change for me. So my exit from my corporate, career, I was looking to basically move somewhere from where I lived outside of Chicago. I lived in the suburbs of Chicago, and I was looking for like the most nature and the most water I could find, in the United States. And I'm looking basically up, across all the northern border from Montana all the way across to Minnesota, and then even looking at like Michigan, Wisconsin. And my boss's last name at the time was Ely, E-L-Y. And I found this little town called Ely, Minnesota, that is on the doorstep of the boundary waters. So there's basically like 2 million acres of protected wilderness where you can canoe and camp, and motors aren't even allowed in there. You can't like snowmobile or bring a fishing boat in. And this is where I decided I was going to move, and when I'm looking for houses up there, a woman that worked for me comes into my office and she's like, Keith, what I think you should do is move to a place like Ely, Minnesota. I hadn't mentioned this to anybody. I'm like Googling this in secret at home, planning my exit from the suburbs of Chicago, and this comes up. And then there was so many, like I have it written down somewhere, but dozens of things like from then that led on to leaving that company, moving up to Minnesota, building mobile saunas, running an Airbnb, flipping an old like liquor store. Had a lot of synchronicities with like addresses and names and numbers. I'll tell you another, probably the most wild one, and then I'll give you a couple that have to do with Bittensor, and we'll get past the personal stuff. But the most wild synchronicity I've ever experienced was I bought 600 or 700 wilderness like survival type books with like, how to make a fire, maps, cross country skiing, how to fish, all this stuff for like northern Minnesota camping. And I was going to create this like library where people, when they went up there to camp, could like pay, $5 for a book, take it out and kind of beat it up on their camping trip with them. And if they bring it back, it only costs the $5. And if they don't bring it back, they pay the full price for the book. So I bought all these used books online, and my mom and I are going through these used books. She like came up to help me organize them. And we're like putting them on this shelf, this is like 5 years ago. And, we get to this one book, and I'm not opening most of the books because you can kind of tell what the topic is by the cover. And I decide to open one, and it says Gail Borden Public Library on the inside. There was hundreds that I didn't open. I opened like one or two. This is the library in the town that I grew up in that my mom would take me when I was like 2 years old to go like play on the playground at the library, just like the community playground or whatever. And so I'm like, oh, I can't believe it. I opened this book and it's from our own library that we used to go to when we were, when I was a kid, like 30 years before that. And so then I get into the car and I call my now wife, who was living in Germany at the time. And I wanted to tell her this synchronicity. So I'm like, yeah, you wouldn't believe it. We're opening all these books. And I found this one from the Gail Borden Library in the town I grew up in, a little town called Elgin. And my mom like just jumps in and says like, so Anna, where are you at? What are you doing? And she's like, oh, I'm actually at my family's lake house in Poland. It's like, 8 or 9 hours from where I live in Germany. And I just kind of offhandedly mentioned like, oh, that sounds like, about the same distance from where I live to where I'm at now in Ely, Minnesota. Like we're both the same distance from our home, and we're both kind of like vacationing, or in my case, moving to this lake situation, lakeside properties or vacation homes or whatever. And so like we move on and the conversation ends. And like an hour later, I'm like walking the dog, and I'm thinking like something is funny about that situation. There was like an inkling, and a lot of these synchronicities, they happen this way, where you have like this thought where you're kind of like, I think I should dig like a little bit deeper than where I dug just a few minutes ago, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to find something there. And when you get that feeling, there's almost always something there. This is what I've learned. I now follow all those feelings. A lot of them lead not necessarily to where I think they're going to lead, but some of them, there is gold there. And in this particular one, I call my my wife now, and I said, Anna, I'm pretty sure if we check like the distance between your house and where your house in Germany and where you're at in Poland and her family's lake house, they've had it for like 40 years or something. And if we check where I am now in Ely and from where I grew up, I'm pretty sure the distance is going to be the same. So I just type it into Google, the address to address. Get the, it comes out to like, 536 point something miles. I don't remember the exact number. And I type hers into Google, and it comes out in kilometers. And I had just spent 2 years living in Germany. So I knew like couldn't like do it off the top of my head, kilometers and miles, but I knew it was going to be close. And I'm like, holy shit, we have to check this. So I type it into the conversion thing in Google, and it converts it to miles. The distance is exactly the same, down to a tenth of a mile. So it literally says the exact, what are the chances of that happening? first you have to find the book for the library thing to kick off the conversation. Then you have to believe in it enough and think it's special enough to make the other phone call. Then my mom has to jump in and like bring this like, random question up about where Anna is. And then we have to then, an hour later, like have this inkling come in that leads to the Googling. Then you do the conversion from kilometers to miles and the numbers are the exact same. And it's just like,
It's mind blowing. And you know what? You said something really interesting there. And I think it holds true, right? If you just tell this story, people could easily just, one off, hey, it's a coincidence, who knows? But there's something innate inside you that when you have one of these synchronicities, and I've had them before as well, you get this internal feeling, right? That either you're on the right path or, you're doing something that's leading to something bigger. And I'll tell you, when I found Bitcoin for the first time, it was the exact same feeling. It was like just this sheer unshakable conviction that, this is a technology, one, that's going to change the world, that's going to be revolutionary for people all over the world, and it's going to be extremely beneficial. And I'll tell you, I had that exact same feeling in finding Bittensor. So I just think it's really interesting that, maybe we can sum these synchronicities up to an understanding that we are on the right path, or an understanding that, that we're doing something we're meant to do.
Yeah. And with Bittensor, like if you're especially involved in the mining side or the validating side, or you're building a subnet, or you're looking at TAO stats or whatever, there's numbers all the time, And what you'll find is, if you pay attention, I think what you'll find is that a lot of those numbers tend to speak with you in some way or another. Like when I first got into the Bittensor ecosystem, like almost 2 years ago now, the guy's validator that I was staking my TAO with was like UID 1211. And previous to that, when I was getting out of Minnesota and basically liquidating all my real life assets to invest in Bittensor, at that time it was more of just like a swing for the fences. The network had no utility like it does today. It was very much like, a long shot. I had just sold an Airbnb and the address was 1121. And I had just sold a liquor store that I had kind of rehabbed, and the address to that was 1221. And the UID that is then presented to me randomly, that I'm taking the two biggest investments that I have in my life, getting rid of them and putting it into the next one, is like the very next logical number from 1221 to 1121 to 1211. Once I saw that UID, I'm just like putting it all in.
Hey,
liquidating everything.
Congratulations. Congratulations on that. Yeah. No,
and that's part of the thing that basically led me to where I am today with Bittensor, is having the guts to follow some of these things. And there's a couple other ones like that I tell around. I was reading this book called Turtle Planet by a guy named Yoon Roo, and he's a monk. He wrote this other book that's kind of popular called The Mad Monk Manifesto. He's been on Duncan Trussell podcast a few times. He did this, he had this kind of like near-death experience where he almost died from some kind of infection thing. And one of the ending sort of like visions that he had was around AI, sort of like the ending of humanity, ending in some like upload into an AI crab in space. And just like a really wild thing coming from this monk, And I kind of heard that while I was doing all this like initial investment into Bittensor. And at the same time as I heard that, like I started to learn about the Yuma consensus, and there's this like fictitious unknown character, kind of like Satoshi for Bitcoin. And it's Yuma Rao is the name of it. This is like the moniker that was used to pen the byline on the original white paper. So this guy is like, if some of the early Bittensor swag would have on the back of it, like, who is Yuma Rao, And this is where you get the Yuma consensus from, which basically drives the consensus and incentive mechanism that the validators use to evaluate miners in Bittensor. So this guy's name is Yoon Roo. It's like 2 letters off of Yuma, consent of Yuma Rao, And then at the same time as I'm reading this Turtle Planet book, I'm seeing like, first of all, I haven't seen a turtle now for like years. But at that time, I saw like there was like 17 turtles in my backyard. There was turtles all over the place, like crossing the road. I saved a giant snapping turtle on the highway that I saw that was flipped upside down. And like all of this happened within a week. Like while I was reading this book, while I was making this connection, I'm wondering like, does this Yuma Rao and Yoon Roo thing, like, does it really mean that I should jump more into Bittensor than I already am? And it was another one that just like pushed me even further off the deep end into this project.
Well, look, I mean, I'm sure we could talk about synchronicities for the entire podcast, but I'm sure some other people want to hear your insights on the network itself. You know, and I want to get into the interplay between crypto and AI. And something that I was unaware of before finding Bittensor is that maybe by and large, and I don't know if I'm offending some people by saying this, but by and large, the AI community are not really big fans of the crypto community. And so, you know, a lot of times AI people can tend to write off a project just simply based on the fact that it's built on crypto rails. But I want to get your opinion as to, you know, knowing what you know about AI, why is it so important that this AI specifically be built on crypto rails, or I guess said in another way, use crypto-based incentives?
Yeah, I think there's a couple elements to this that make it totally key to sort of putting this project in the position to do what it's due now and attracting people from this AI ML community to build on it. And number one is nobody has a lot of confidence in fiat currency anymore. So, I mean, I think anyone would basically say, like, if you're holding the dollar, if you're holding the pound, if you're holding the yen at this point, everyone knows that the, you know, devaluation of this currency is essentially happening at a rate that hasn't happened for decades, or in some cases more than 100 years. So, or almost 100 years, you know, going back to like the Great Depression or whatever. I see it at the grocery store every day for what I'm paying for stuff. So if I'm going to denominate, you know, my project in a certain value, if I'm trying to create a commodity, which is what Bittensor has done with TAO, is taken all the steps from you know, the team not doing any marketing, no pre-sale, no like, you know, ICO stuff, no exchange listings that are even managed at all by the Opentensor Foundation, who does the coding for the client for Bittensor, and also the, you know, the network, and makes a lot of the governance decisions, especially early on. So they made all of these you know, decisions to try and pass the Howey test to be classified as a commodity, to put the ecosystem in a position where you can then create the most value for this fixed asset, just like Bitcoin, except that the commodity is now able to purchase intelligence instead of having to rely on a, you know, essentially a confidence, a consumer confidence or a holder's confidence of Bitcoin, where, you know, it doesn't necessarily do anything but secure the network itself. Whereas with Bittensor, what you have with TAO is this commodity that if you hold enough of it as a validator, you can access the intelligence on the 30 different subnets, soon to be 30 subnets that we have up and running at this time. And in addition to that, what you have to then build in order for this whole thing to be incentivized is a blockchain, so that you can do all of the consensus mechanisms and everything, really up to the point where you have smart contracts to drive the way that Bittensor has the communication and the emissions going from the miners and validators and subnet owners. You have to have like an enclosed sort of, you know, environment where this thing is traded in a way that doesn't have factors influencing from the outside, things that can devalue it or change the value, independent of the real operations and happenings on the network itself. So this, for me, allows me to have confidence in the value of Bittensor, because it's not, you know, yes, of course, it's riding the AI narrative, but the value of Bittensor is entirely based on what you can get for it on the network, you know?
Yeah, and I look at the crypto component almost as like a bootstrapping mechanism. Like if we look at traditional large language models or traditional AI companies, OpenAI, for example, you know, in order to get to scale, they needed $10 billion for Microsoft to, you know, buy the H100s and A100s, and also to pay all the, you know, the AI annotators and, you know, fine tuners. That model is almost flipped on its head in the crypto space, because people are getting compensated with a token that innately doesn't have value outside of the fact that people believe it will have value because they believe the network will eventually scale to have, multitudes of value. And the same thing was true with Bitcoin. I mean, the whole moniker of number go up, the reason number goes up is because people find out about the network and buy into the network. The same reason that, telecom companies grow exponentially and social media companies grow exponentially. The same is true with networks that are based on crypto rails. But I know, so for example, this project, it takes a lot of people in from the AI space, right? I think it's obviously now just with number go up, starting to bring a lot of people in from the crypto space. But we know that the crypto space is very segmented. I would say there's camps, right? And I want to make the case for Bittensor being very much in the camp of the Bitcoiners. So I want to read you just a short tweet I made the other day, or at least a bit of a tweet, and I want to hear your opinion on it. So I said, investing in a company is very different than investing in a belief system. What makes Bittensor so special is exactly what made Bitcoin so special. It reflects a belief system. Bitcoin's belief system is a belief in sound money, a belief in fair competition, a belief in distributed compute, a belief in free market economics, and the belief of separation of money and state. A Bittensor's belief system is the belief in sound money, the belief in fair competition, the belief in distributed compute, the belief in free market economics, and the belief that AI should be owned by many as opposed to few, right? So many of those beliefs are the exact same beliefs as the ones that the Bitcoiners have. Yet, it's one coin to rule them all versus, the rest of the crypto space. But I want to hear your opinion on that. Like, do you think we're closer to the Bitcoiners than some might think?
I think especially in the early years with Bittensor, like if you go back to the investors that got in 2021 or especially 2022, when the network was promising a lot of things, and a lot of the things that you already described, in addition to it being completely open, it's permissionless, just like Bitcoin, the decentralized aspect that you mentioned, the anonymous aspect, so anyone can come in, you don't even know who they are, they're mining, they're validating, and there's still validators out there with hundreds of thousands of TAO that we don't even know who they are. I mean, some people probably have a decent idea, but it's not like everybody's doxed in this ecosystem either. And the way that the project worked early on is it really leveraged all of these values to then get the buy-in from the crypto community, because these are things that people that hold Bitcoin and have for years hold as like the truths of the monetary system of the future, right? And that's all of these values that you mentioned are the things that make Bitcoin what it is, and things that make TAO what it is. And that is how, they got the crypto community involved to, like you said, bootstrap the whole thing. And going back to what you said earlier about kind of now that we have way more AI and ML talent coming into the space, like this is something that we always talked about early on when we were getting into this thing, like wait until the real talent arrives from the AI and ML community, because early on you were able to mine and validate without really having to know very much about artificial intelligence. You didn't have to be an engineer, have a CS degree or anything. It was easy enough to run just the stock stuff and participate. And the bootstrapping that did happen then from the crypto community was always going to be, those guys, those players in the ecosystem were always going to be replaced by the AI ML engineers if this thing was going to be a success. And now what you're seeing is, we've attracted the attention from groups like Noose Research, who have a team of 50 plus engineers, that they've kind of like handpicked from a Discord now that has over 5,000 people on it. Those guys are all over Hugging Face. We've got another company involved in Bittensor called TensorPlex, also fantastic engineers, and you'll find them at the top of the leaderboards for like Subnet 6 and Subnet 9. And what this is doing is it's ushering in sort of a changing of the guard for Bittensor that, for people like me, I'm happy to sort of take the back seat and ride my validator for as long as I can keep it running with the skills that I have. But I am also happy to see myself and the other miners that are sort of operating in a less skilled way be replaced by some of the true talent that's been developing out there in the open source community for years.
I think very well said. And this is one of the amazing things of Yuma Consensus, right? Is how it naturally just incentivizes better, stronger, faster, cheaper competition to enter the market. And, the lowest performing ones get booted out, right? So you get this continuous improvement across every subnet, which, in turn, adds more value to the entire network. So let's turn it over, because you talked a little bit about your validator. You are probably one of the most active people in the community. You're validating pretty well on every subnet. Maybe just take us back, because you didn't come from a computer science background yourself. And you often maybe don't give yourself enough credit for the technical knowledge that you have specifically in this domain. But tell us a little bit about how you got started on that. Like, how did you get started building your validator, and how has that just kind of morphed into this now full-time job over time?
Yeah, I mean, in the early days, we had about 20 people on a validator that somebody else ran. And in those days, there was no such thing as delegating. Every single person physically sent their TAO to this dude's address that we never met. And this guy had hundreds of thousands of TAO back when there was only like 2 million or 1 million. I mean, there was barely, I don't even remember what the TAO count was, but that validator was like a huge percent of the network, all sitting on one guy's wallet that nobody ever met. And like, this goes back to how the community was back then. It was much more, kind of, at least in the group that I joined with, kind of like a kumbaya situation. We've actually since sort of that group that I was in has sort of split off into maybe 2 or 3 different groups. At one point, when we realized back in like October of 22 that we should probably, split this off into different validators, still before there was delegating, we then broke off into like 5 or 6 different validators from this one. I slowly basically got people into my validator by doing this process of, at that time, there was no 18% either. So everybody earned the same amount. So we created a spreadsheet that just based on how long your TAO had been sitting in there, right? And you were just earning, everybody's earning the same APR at that time. And then it got a little bit more complicated when the delegation aspect was introduced, because then yes, okay, you don't have to worry about the trust part. That's great. But then when the 18% comes on, which the validator takes from the delegation, so in the ecosystem, you technically, stakers are called nominators, and they delegate their TAO to the validator, and then the validator earns 18% of the APR that person gets in a trustless way in the wallet that they're delegating from. So what I did from the beginning, because all of the guys that were delegated with me, we'd been already working on this project together for, almost more than a year at that time, is just send back the 18% that we were getting, and I would send it back to the people that were delegated to me, because I never even thought about keeping it. Really, the 18% was put in there to encourage validators to develop on the network. And going back to my technical skills, since I wasn't paying anybody or doing it myself and building on the network, and at that point there weren't even subnets, so you were really just trying to build different ways where the validator could have a front end, for example, and plug into the ecosystem through an API and ping the 1 or 2 subnets that we had. But now what happened, 6 months ago or so is I opened up the validator to everybody and anybody that wanted to stake to us, still giving back the 18%. Mainly, I didn't really feel too bad about that, because the 18% was also by that time, or shortly after, introduced to the subnet owners as well. So if you were building on Bittensor, you didn't have to rely on anymore your validator to fund your development. Your holding of the subnet would fund itself. I have since now, in the last month, actually, we're 10 days into a new kind of formula that we're using with the validator, where we are still sending back 80% of our 18% take. We are keeping 20% in a community-owned wallet that will be investing in various projects in Bittensor, supporting different initiatives. essentially I'll be using my knowledge of the ecosystem to take that 20% and the 20% of the 18%. So it's really a pretty small percent of the overall, dividends. It's, what is it, less than 4% of the total APR that the validator would earn in a single month. And that's going to be reinvested back in the ecosystem. And I'm also, just the same way that I keep track of the wallets, there's like 750 of them now that are delegated to our validator. Those wallets, we keep track of when they add TAO and take out TAO. So it's this fluid thing. There's snapshots every 2 hours. That's how we calculate what we send back at the end of the month. We're also keeping track of the wallets that are contributing to this 20%. And if we make anything from this 20% by investing into a subnet or another company, maybe a startup in the Bittensor space or something, the wallets that contribute to that through that 20% will also receive additional TAO in their monthly payout. So we've gotten so big, it's time to use our size to start, lighting a fire under some of the different things that I know need funding, is participating in the ecosystem. So that's what we're doing now.
Absolutely. And, you say it's a small percentage, but in nominal terms, it's actually a large amount of TAO, right?
That's true.
You guys are pulling in 700 TAO a month that you are actually kindly, graciously distributing back to your stakers. So
I think 1,300. We sent out 1,300.
1,300.
Yeah. So what was that? It was like 600,000 TAO that we, or 600,000 USD, that we sent out at the beginning of February. And so we'll be keeping, if assuming that stays the same, about $100,000 to reinvest in the ecosystem. So call it $1 million a year that we'll be pumping back in through the gracious, thank you, delegators, for continuing to put your trust in us and allowing us to do that. In the end, it's going to benefit the price way more than it would than if I sent back the 20% to everybody and they just added it to their wallet anyway. So
let me give you your flowers real quick, because I think, one, people trust you with their delegation because, one, you've been in the space so long. You've been an outspoken advocate of Bittensor. You've probably yourself brought a lot of people into the space, and to be fair, you were in many cases my Bittensor guru, getting me started on the space. So you've probably done that for a lot of people now, and I think the delegation that you have is well deserved. But you're not just validating; you're doing some other stuff, building some subnets, some cellular automata. I can never get that right. Automata. Tell me a little bit about this. I actually did my homework. I watched Conway's Game of Life. I learned a little bit about cellular automata. But on your last, or maybe one of your last podcasts, you talked about building the subnet around cellular automata. And you said something a little bit cryptic, and you're like, I don't know what's going to come out of this, but I think we're going to find something about the other side. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because after just going down a brief rabbit hole on cellular automata, it seems like there's something there, but I don't know exactly what it is. So what are your thoughts?
The way and we can call it CA, then it's easier.
It's easier.
You'd have to stumble over the words. I do it too all the time. Now, cellular automata is like computational sort of like reality. And, there's a guy named Stephen Wolfram. I'm reading this book right now. Look how thick this thing is. It's like 1,200 pages. And, the reviews on Stephen Wolfram's work on this stuff is kind of mixed. But what you cannot deny, and you don't have to read the book to know this, but there's trillions. And actually, there's really infinity, but let's just call it trillions of different rule sets and starting patterns, each of these developing into, after you run them for a number of steps with these very simple computer programs, into a pattern that is represented visually or through code. And what this is sort of like deep sea fishing for like novelty and complexity in these spaces that have never been explored. So it's almost like, what's on like the other side of the moon, or like I mentioned, the deep sea fishing, like the bottom of the ocean. There's untold number, like way more than trillions, whatever the next number is, quintillion, or I don't even know, of these calculations that have never been done. And what you can see is, if you look at the ones that have been done, because there's been millions that have been completed, there's a very small percentage of them that generates something that looks interesting. And when you look at it, I get the same feeling as I do when I, get this like little tingle about a synchronicity or something. And I can feel the pull. And I could go into some synchronistic stuff. You can listen to the podcast too, but I won't bore you guys with that about the CA too. But there's a ton of stuff there as well that I've experienced that is leading us down this development path. So what we're doing is standing on the shoulders of guys like Stephen Wolfram. We're creating a subnet where the miners are going to be computing different rule sets and starting patterns for cellular automata, generating these arrays that are hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, who knows how long. We'll see how developed the subnet gets with participation from the miners. And we will then be using an artificial intelligence to train off of these to then further identify complexity so that we use the output from the subnet to train an AI to tell it what it needs to be looking for. Then we use that AI eventually as part of the reward model so that when the miners in the future are allowed to contribute outside of what we request, because we'll begin the subnet by asking them to do certain rule sets and things. So it's more of like here's a list, go complete these calculations, come back. After we get a certain amount of a data set, then we bring the AI into the equation, and then we say, let's see what you can come up with. And the AI itself determines how complex it is, how novel it is. Do the patterns repeat? And there's like many different ways to grade these things, but all kinds of like very interesting shapes that would suggest that there's something at work here that is beyond just the ones and zeros, and I could keep going on it, but they probably get it.
Well, man, it kind of gives me shivers thinking about how this is now possible, right? Like if we put it into context as this incentivized subnet that is incentivizing the training or at least the computation of these game of life models or these CA models, right? In the past, I guess most likely, Web 2 companies or AI companies would never throw millions or billions of dollars into figuring out what these patterns might be, right? There's no clear endpoint and clear, I guess, North Star that you're looking for. Right now, we're just kind of looking for those patterns. But this is really the first time there's been an incentive to put that type of compute to work in this way. And we're really just, you guys are really just kind of charting new waters, exploring new continents with this type of subnet that have never been explored. And what I think is really interesting is this specific type of compute can teach us a lot about how the world works, how populations grow and fall. Maybe teach us a lot about time. And I think there's just a big, big rabbit hole that we can go down here. So I'm really excited to see some of the things that come out of this subnet.
Yeah, and it can just be simple 2D stuff. It can go into 3D. You can build castles with CA. There's all kinds of different things where you can link it up to real, there's like computational biology that can be integrated. The sky is the limit with this stuff. And like you said, we don't know what's there. All we know is that when you look at enough of these things, stuff starts showing up that really shouldn't be there and that nobody can explain why it is. And no one's ever been incentivized or provided the incentivization to dig into this stuff. And, this is the type of thing where you find something crazy because no one's been there before, It's like going into the computational Amazon or something and like finding a new species. That's what we're sort of like encouraging people to do with this subnet. So yeah, we're excited about it, man.
Very, very excited. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be excited about. I want to ask you your thoughts on some other subnets and things around that. But before I do so, let's talk quickly about dynamic TAO. Because I know this is something that's probably on a lot of people's minds. Maybe people have differing opinions on it. One, I just want to hear your thoughts, or maybe if you could give us a brief overview of what this dynamic TAO upgrade is gonna do and how it's gonna affect the network, and then maybe hear your thoughts.
Yeah, the way to think about dynamic TAO is a shifting from a sort of an oligarchy on the incentive mechanism to one driven by the market. So in the future with and we'll probably have, iterations on this bit one proposal, but if anyone's interested, there's a white paper out there It's called the Bit 1 proposal, and that's the first iteration of dynamic TAO. Dynamic TAO uses pools. So subnet tokens will fill each of these pools along with TAO. And as the miners and validators that operate in these individual subnets are awarded in the subnet token, the swapping of the subnet token for TAO or the swapping of TAO for the subnet token either increases or decreases the amount of emissions for that subnet. So as an example, if you're mining on the subnet and you earn 1 TAO and you take that, you earn 1 subnet token and you convert that subnet token to TAO, that will reduce in a very small way the emissions for that subnet. It acts almost as a confidence interval. Like, do you think holding that TAO on that subnet is going to give you access to intelligence that's worth more than selling it for a TAO right now? That's essentially the question you're asking yourself when you decide to hold it or not, right? Or are other people going to hold it? On the other side of the equation, the TAO that you're holding, when you convert it to the subnet token, increases the emissions compared to the other 2 subnets. And that's, like the market buying into a new subnet because of the marketing or the utility, or they want to be a validator to get access to the intelligence, or whatever the reason is. They want to gamble on earning the APR, right? Because in the future, the APR that everybody earns now, which is more or less in the same ballpark, no matter which validator you're on, if you're on one of the top 10 or so, that moves to a system where you'll have many, many more validators because the validation mechanism is now subnet specific. So right now, when we have 420,000 TAO staked on the Bittensor Guru validator, every subnet that I go into, I'm a big gorilla with 420,000 TAO. In the future, I'll have to purchase the subnet token in order to validate on that subnet. So I alone, or whoever is delegating to me, actually, will determine where they're leading the subnet, right? So my delegators will be like, hey, we want you to run on subnet 30. Here's a bunch of subnet 30 token. And then as a validator, I have to go onto subnet 30 and put those tokens to work. Otherwise, they don't earn any APR. So that ends up steering where the validators go, the bigger ones. But what it's really going to do is break the whole ecosystem up into these large validators right now. If you look at the top 6 or 7 validators, they have 70% of the TAO or something. In the future, there's going to be many, many smaller validators, and there's going to be much stronger validators on one subnet that don't even do anything on any other subnet. Because the way to earn the best APR in the future, the maximum APR, is to go all in on one subnet. And if that subnet is the winner compared to the other 32, and you've been validating there, that's the best you can possibly do. And you could also be like trading every day or whatever, but excluding that, that's the way that's going to have to work. And so that'll drive a whole lot of speculation, and it will also use the people in the know on the mining and validating side to determine what the emissions of the subnet are. Because currently, what you have is people like myself that are manually going in and adjusting the weights on each of the subnets on the root network based upon what I can absorb while I'm running the validator. There's about 1 million different factors that you have to consider when you're deciding which subnets to give which emissions. And it's really not possible as a single person to do this. So the market, just like the market is the decider, for all of the stocks in the world out there and the value of them, there's not like one person deciding where money's being allocated to. And when it is, like it is for a mutual fund or something, it's broken because it's totally manipulated. We can get into that too. But the way it's going to work with dynamic TAO is the market mechanism drives the whole thing. It's I expect also, because there's some pushback from kind of like the retail investor. I don't want to speculate. You already are speculating. You just don't know it because the subnets right now that are getting liquid, that are not providing a lot of value, and the miners know it. They're definitely like selling that TAO, and that's being paid for by the utility of the subnets that are carrying the ecosystem. So this is already happening. This will expose that now, which is fantastic. It will also force this mechanism that you talked about, this churn that goes on in the Bittensor ecosystem, not only on the mining side, but it'll like it'll speed up that churn on the subnet side as well, because you'll see vast differences in the emissions rather than right now. There isn't huge differences from the largest subnet that maybe has like 10, 12% and the smallest of 2, 3%. You're going to get like spikes of like 20, probably 30% or something as people like shove all their money into the subnet that everybody trusts. and run from the ones that they don't. And the ones that they don't will get recycled much quicker. And that's kind of how dynamic TAO will work. But real quick, then I'll end this kind of rant. I do expect with the next proposal, the Bit2 proposal, is there'll be something made available for the retail investor who doesn't want to like pick a subnet, and you'll probably get your emissions nerfed and your APR will go down quite a bit if you go that route. But I think you will be able to put your TAO to work across the subnet ecosystem, sort of like, you know, buying an S&P 500 index fund or something, just to make that group happy.
Yeah, no, I think that was very well said, very all-encompassing. A couple things I would also add, right? The way that I look at subnet tokens is exactly like what they're producing, a digital commodity, right? And right now, when you buy TAO, you're betting on the entire ecosystem, all the digital commodities that are being produced, whether that's cellular automata, whether that's image generation, whether that's storage or compute, etc. Post dynamic TAO, you'll have the ability to bet on which of those digital commodities you think is the most valuable. And, you know, if you think that a rising tide raises all ships, sure, you can hold your TAO. And as you said, you can maybe get your APR nerfed. But if you are incentivized to learn more about the ecosystem by finding out which subnets are valuable, where is your money best at work, and what subnets are producing the highest value commodity. This one incentivizes people to learn more about what they're actually investing in, which I think is a really important piece. But two, it rewards the people that are actually the most educated and the ones that are the most deeply entrenched and ingrained in the ecosystem. So from all perspectives, I think it's a logical progression. I think it's the right progression. It helps decentralize the network. As you said, it breaks up some of the larger validators, maybe like yourself. But that's a good thing, because that's what we should push for in the ecosystem, is further decentralization. I know we're running up on time here, but I want to give a quick speed round, given you're extremely knowledgeable about really all this subnets and you validate on most. Quickly, maybe outside of cellular automata, what are some of the subnets you're most excited for?
Subnet 6, because new research has come in and brought the top tier talent from the AI ML community. They're doing a fine tuning based upon what's called a synthetic data pipeline, which is bringing in data constantly, fresh data from Subnet 18, essentially from ChatGPT 4 Turbo, and using that to grade these models that are constantly being submitted by the miners. And there's hundreds of miners submitting new models constantly, because the top tier miner on that subnet can earn upwards of 70, 80, 90,000 USD per day. You know, it's like a huge carrot at the top of this thing. And this is what Bittensor was built for.
Absolutely. What subnets make it the easiest for you to validate on?
Subnet 8. I just put a post up the other day on this thing because I went in there just to check. I forgot why I had to check something. Maybe it hadn't updated in 1,000 blocks or whatever. And I realized that the subnet had been running untouched for 27 days. I think that's an all-time record for me. I don't think I have any other subnet that had gone that long without me having to do something. They employ something called auto update. So anytime they update their code, I don't have to go in and do a git pull on the repo on GitHub and then do the install and then restart the PM2 and do the whole thing. It just happens automatically. So a subnet 8 for sure, I got to say. And that's because that team is so solid.
And this is something that I'm learning is very important as we're kind of going through this process of looking to launch our own subnet. It's not just how good of a digital commodity you can create, but it's also how easy it is for validators to get spun up and keep their machines running. Also, how costly it is for subnets. So maybe we go into the next one. What is the most costly subnet to run?
I think it's subnet 17. It used to be subnet 18, because subnet 18 at one point we had a couple $1,000s in OpenAI, API fees, like the first month it was running. So that was the most. Basically, to run a validator right now, it costs about 10 grand a month to run on all the subnets. Subnet 17 requires a CPU on a separate server, and then you also have to run an A100. So that's like $250 an hour, so $50 a day. That's like what, $1,500 a month or so. So that subnet is probably taking the cake as the most expensive, but it's also got quite a bit of weight put on it right now. So it's definitely still profitable to operate there.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Final question is, which subnet has the best documentation?
I like I like subnet 1, and I'm going to take that one because it's so easy to set up. But the main reason I like it is because subnet 1, which is run by the Opentensor Foundation, they have put the time into creating a huge amount of visibility around their incentive mechanism. So if you were, part of if you listened to the TGIFT a couple of weeks ago, where the CTO of Bittensor was essentially explaining subnet 1, and they did an even deeper dive at the end of last year, they opened up like the whole books on how they're building that subnet out to essentially be like the operating system for the Bittensor ecosystem, and how the incentive mechanism is being designed to do that. So even though it's not documentation on like how to run a validator, it's documentation that exposes to me the work and effort and time that's being put into building the incentive mechanism, which is the most important part of any subnet.
Well said. Look, we're running out of time. I would love to do this again sometime. I think we just kind of scratched the tip of the iceberg on what we could talk about here, but really appreciate you coming on, appreciate your time, and thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks, man. See you later.
All right, one final disclosure from our legal department. None of the companies featured on this show are paid promotions. This podcast is simply an extension of our diligence process here at Contango. That said, we may eventually invest in some of the projects we cover. Nothing in this show should be considered investment advice. Crypto is risky. Always do your own research and never invest more than you can afford to lose. That's our show. If you like the content, please like and subscribe on whatever podcast platform you use. And don't let the alpha stop now. If you're a crypto investor, researcher, developer, or founder, we would love to meet you. You can apply to our free private alpha group where we host discussions, share opportunities, and connect some of the brightest minds in crypto. You can find more information on our website at contango.digital. Until next time, keep your ears down and alpha up.